The Galactic Command did not expect the report to be submitted with trembling appendages, nor did they expect Commander Virex, decorated veteran of 12 star systems, to begin his log with a sentence that would later become infamous across the Coalition. Humanity is not tactically sane. The conflict began as routine expansion enforcement on the outer edges of human-controlled space, a region deemed insignificant due to its lack of advanced infrastructure and apparent political disunity. Intelligence suggested humans were divided by culture, language, and internal conflict, making them ideal for swift subjugation. Initial scans showed outdated fleets, inconsistent defense grids, and communication systems riddled with inefficiencies. It should have been easy. It was not. From the very first encounter, humans behaved in ways that violated every known principle of interstellar warfare. Instead of retreating when outmatched, they advanced. Instead of conserving resources, they expended them unpredictably. Their formations broke apart mid-battle, only to reassemble into something entirely new. Commander Virex noted that their ships appeared to act independently, almost chaotically, yet somehow achieved coordinated results. They used civilian vessels as decoys, transmitted false signals mixed with music, and even broadcast jokes during combat. At first it was dismissed as primitive confusion. Then the losses began. The second phase of engagement was meant to correct the anomaly. Reinforcements were deployed, algorithms adjusted, predictive models recalibrated, yet the humans escalated in ways that defied logic. They launched attacks not at strategic points, but at symbolic ones: abandoned stations, obsolete satellites, even empty space, forcing coalition forces to divert attention and resources. They created problems where none existed, then exploited the confusion they themselves had caused. Commander Virex recorded an incident where a single human pilot deliberately crashed into a coalition cruiser, not as a last resort, but as a calculated maneuver to disable its shielding long enough for smaller craft to swarm it. This was not bravery. It was not desperation. It was something else entirely. Humans did not fear loss in the same way other species did. They seemed to treat sacrifice as a tool, not a tragedy. Even more disturbing was their communication style. Instead of clear commands, they used layered messages filled with emotion, humor, and cultural references. Coalition translators struggled to interpret them, often missing critical intent. Meanwhile, human units adapted in real time, changing tactics mid-battle without centralized command. It was as if each individual possessed both autonomy and unity simultaneously. Virex began to suspect that the human strength was not in their technology, but in their unpredictability. By the third cycle, the war had shifted from a campaign to a phenomenon. Reports flooded in from multiple fronts, all echoing the same conclusion. Humans could not be predicted. They set traps that made no sense until they were sprung. They retreated only to lure enemies into ambushes constructed from debris and environmental hazards. They used asteroids, solar flares, and even their own damaged ships as weapons. In one instance, a human engineer rigged a failing reactor to explode in a controlled pattern, creating a temporary barrier of radiation that blocked coalition reinforcements while allowing human ships, somehow shielded, to pass through. The science division could not explain it. The tactical division could not counter it. And the psychological division began to issue warnings. Humans were not just fighting a war. They were rewriting its rules in real time. Commander Virex's logs grew increasingly erratic, filled with observations that bordered on disbelief. He described humans laughing during battle, comforting each other in the midst of destruction, and forming bonds that extended beyond species. There were documented cases of humans rescuing enemy survivors, only to fight them again hours later. This contradiction baffled coalition logic. War was supposed to be efficient, calculated, devoid of unnecessary emotion. Humans made it personal, chaotic, and strangely meaningful. The turning point came not with a decisive battle, but with a moment of unity that no one had predicted. Human factions, once divided, began to coordinate, not through a central authority, but through shared purpose. Messages spread across their networks, simple, emotional, powerful. They were not commands, they were calls, and humans responded. Fleets that had never worked together suddenly moved in harmony. Civilian populations contributed resources, intelligence, even direct support. It was not organized in the traditional sense, yet it functioned with terrifying efficiency. Commander Virex witnessed a combined human fleet emerge from hyperspace in perfect synchronization, despite having no unified command structure. They attacked from multiple vectors, using tactics that individually made no sense but collectively overwhelmed coalition defenses. It was chaos, but it was controlled chaos, like a storm that knew exactly where to strike. VRX realized then that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or their numbers, but their ability to adapt, to connect, and to act with both individuality and unity. They were unpredictable because they were free, and that freedom made them unstoppable. The final entry in Commander Virex's report was not a recommendation for further action, but a warning. The coalition had lost, not because it was weaker, but because it was rigid. It relied on logic, prediction, and order, principles that had worked against every other species. But humans were different. They thrived in uncertainty. They embraced contradiction. They turned weakness into strength and confusion into strategy. Virex concluded that any attempt to conquer humanity would result not in victory, but in transformation of the battlefield, of the rules, and perhaps of the coalition itself. He ended his log with a statement that would be studied for generations. Humans do not fight wars the way we understand them. They experience them, reshape them, and ultimately redefine them. As the remaining coalition forces withdrew, they did so not in defeat, but in reluctant respect. Humanity had not just survived. It had proven something far more dangerous, that sanity in war is not always an advantage. And somewhere, across the vast silence of space, human voices echoed, not in triumph, but in laughter, in unity, and in the quiet, unshakable certainty that no matter the odds, they would always find a way. Commander Virex did not sleep after submitting his initial report, though his physiology required rest cycles. Instead, he remained in the observation chamber, replaying fragments of human transmissions, isolating patterns that refused to become patterns. The Coalition's Central Command responded with what it always used against uncertainty: more control. New directives arrived, stricter formations, tighter communication protocols, and a complete ban on deviation from predictive models. It was, in Virex's estimation, the worst possible response. Humans did not resist control in the conventional sense. They dissolved it. The next engagement proved it. Coalition fleets moved in perfect synchronization, every unit positioned according to flawless calculations, every maneuver pre-approved by strategic algorithms. For exactly 6 minutes, it worked. Human ships were forced into retreat, their scattered formations unable to penetrate the unified front. Then, without warning, the humans changed. Not their direction, not their speed, their behavior. They stopped firing. They stopped transmitting. They simply drifted. Coalition targeting systems designed to track active threats began to lose lock. Confusion spread through the command channels. Was this surrender, a malfunction, a trap? Before an answer could be formed, the human ships reignited simultaneously, not as a coordinated fleet, but as hundreds of independent vectors, each moving in a direction that no model had predicted. They passed through the Coalition formation like a storm of fragments, not aiming to destroy, but to disrupt. Shields flickered, communications fractured, formation integrity collapsed, and then just as suddenly, the humans regrouped behind Coalition lines, turning the entire battlefield inside out. Virex recorded the moment not as a tactical failure, but as a conceptual one. The Coalition had assumed that order was strength, that unity required uniformity. Humans demonstrated the opposite, that unity could exist within chaos, that individuality could enhance coordination rather than weaken it. The aftermath of that engagement was worse than the battle itself. Coalition officers began to hesitate, not out of fear, but out of doubt. Predictive systems were questioned. Commands were second-guessed. Meanwhile, human transmissions grew louder, more frequent, and increasingly incomprehensible. They spoke of things unrelated to war, food, memories, jokes, music. Yet somehow, these distractions carried embedded instructions. Virex observed a squadron of human fighters altering course based on what appeared to be a shared song, its rhythm dictating timing, its lyrics masking coordinates. It was absurd. It was effective, and it was impossible to counter without understanding the cultural context behind it. The Coalition began deploying linguistic specialists, but translation lagged behind action. Humans were not just communicating. They were expressing, and within that expression lay a fluid adaptive command structure that no rigid system could replicate. As the conflict stretched into its later cycles, the environment itself became a participant in the war, shaped as much by human ingenuity as by natural forces. Entire sectors were transformed into unpredictable zones where standard navigation failed. Debris fields were rearranged into shifting corridors. Energy signatures fluctuated in patterns that mimicked natural phenomena but concealed deliberate design. In one recorded instance, a human fleet lured coalition forces into the gravitational shadow of a collapsing star fragment. Using its unstable, pulled a slingshot their own ships while trapping the enemy in a spiraling descent. It was not a maneuver taught in any academy. It was not even considered survivable. Yet the humans executed it with precision that bordered on instinct. Virex began to understand that humans did not separate science from creativity or logic from intuition. They blended them, often recklessly, but with results that redefined possibility. Coalition engineers attempted to replicate these tactics, but without the same mindset, they failed. Human strategies were not just actions. They were reflections of a way of thinking that embraced risk, uncertainty, and rapid adaptation as fundamental strengths. What disturbed Virex most was not the destruction, but the resilience. Coalition victories, when they occurred, were temporary. Human forces absorbed losses, learned, and returned with altered tactics that rendered previous successes irrelevant. There was no fixed doctrine to dismantle, no central command to decapitate. Even when key human leaders were identified and eliminated, their absence did not create chaos. It created variation. New leaders emerged, often with entirely different approaches, forcing the coalition to start from zero in its analysis. It was as if humanity evolved in real time, each battle accelerating its development. Reports from ground engagements were even more unsettling. Human soldiers adapted to alien environments with minimal preparation, using local resources in ways that defied expectation. They formed alliances with species previously considered insignificant, leveraging relationships instead of dominance. In one case, a small human unit survived behind enemy lines for an entire cycle, by integrating with a native ecosystem, becoming indistinguishable from it until the moment they struck. This was not just warfare. It was transformation. Humans did not merely enter environments, they became part of them. By the time the coalition initiated its final strategic review, the objective had shifted from victory to understanding. Commander Virex was summoned to present his findings in person, a rare acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation. Standing before the highest authorities of the coalition, he did not present charts or projections. He presented a conclusion. Humans could not be defeated through conventional means because they did not operate within conventional boundaries. They were not bound by the same definitions of logic, efficiency, or even success. They valued survival, yes, but also expression, connection, and meaning. Concepts that the coalition had long considered irrelevant to warfare. Yet it was precisely these elements that gave humans their edge. They fought not just to win, but to assert their identity, to protect their bonds, to prove something intangible yet powerful. And in doing so, they unlocked strategies that no purely logical system could generate. Virex ended his presentation with a recommendation that shocked the assembly. Cease hostilities, not out of weakness, but out of recognition. Humanity was not an enemy to be conquered. It was a force to be understood or avoided. The coalition did not immediately accept Commander Virex's recommendation, but something had shifted in the tone of command. Where there had once been certainty, there was now calculation, layered with caution. A final operation was authorized, not a conquest, but a controlled demonstration of overwhelming force designed to force humanity into submission without prolonged conflict. It was the largest fleet ever assembled under coalition command, a convergence of multiple species, technologies, and doctrines unified into a single, perfectly synchronized entity. Virex was assigned to observe, not command, a decision that unsettled him more than any battle. He understood humans now in a way the others did not, and as he watched the fleet prepare, he felt something unfamiliar, anticipation mixed with dread. When the fleet entered human-controlled space, it did so with precision that bent the very fabric of local reality, a display meant to intimidate, to overwhelm, to end the war before it began. For a moment there was silence, no human response, no scattered signals, no chaotic movements. It was as if humanity had vanished. Coalition commanders interpreted this as success. Virex did not. The first sign came not from sensors, but from absence. Communication relays began to fail, not through destruction, but through interference that could not be traced. Then navigation systems flickered, not enough to disable, but enough to introduce doubt. Ships began to drift out of perfect alignment, their synchronization slipping by fractions that grew into gaps. And still, no visible human presence. It was psychological, Virex realized. Humans were not attacking the fleet. They were unraveling it. The second sign was sound, faint at first, barely detectable across frequencies, then growing clearer. Human transmissions, layered and overlapping, not commands but conversations, laughter, fragments of stories, music woven into static. It spread through the fleet, like a signal-borne infection, impossible to filter because it did not follow any consistent pattern. Some coalition crews reported hearing voices in their own language, others in unknown dialects, all carrying the same unsettling tone, not fear, not aggression, but calm confidence. The fleet held formation, but its cohesion was gone. It was no longer a single entity. It was thousands of ships pretending to be one. Then the humans appeared, not as a fleet, but as a phenomenon. They emerged from every direction, not in massed formations, but in scattered groups, each behaving differently, each breaking a different rule. Some charged directly into the coalition lines, drawing fire, and scattering attention. Others moved along the edges, targeting support systems, supply ships, and communication hubs. A few did nothing at all, simply drifting, observing, forcing coalition commanders to allocate resources to threats that might not exist. It was overwhelming, not because of scale, but because of variation. Every human unit was a new problem, with no predefined solution. Virex watched as coalition strategies collapsed under the weight of their own assumptions. Algorithms failed to converge, commands conflicted, response times slowed, and in that hesitation, humans struck, not decisively, but persistently, eroding the fleet piece by piece. They were not trying to win in a single moment. They were dismantling the concept of victory itself. Amid the chaos, a pattern finally emerged, but only to Virex. It was not in the movements of ships, but in the timing of their actions. There was a rhythm, subtle but consistent, like a pulse, running through the battlefield. Human units acted independently, yet their actions aligned at critical moments, creating brief windows of perfect coordination. It was not planned in the traditional sense. It was felt. Virex realized that humans were synchronizing not through command, but through shared awareness, a collective intuition shaped by constant communication and mutual trust. They did not need orders because they understood intent, and that understanding allowed them to adapt faster than any centralized system ever could. In one decisive sequence, multiple human groups converged on a key coalition flagship, not simultaneously, but in staggered waves that forced its defenses to reset repeatedly until they failed. The ship was not destroyed. It was disabled, isolated, and left intact, a message rather than a victory. By the end of the engagement, the coalition fleet was still operational, still powerful, but fundamentally broken. It could fight, but it could not function as a unified force. The demonstration of strength had become a demonstration of limitation. Commander Virex transmitted his final observation before the withdrawal order was given. Humans do not defeat their enemies by overpowering them, but by forcing them to confront the limits of their own thinking. As the fleet retreated, human ships did not pursue. They lingered at the edges of sensor range, watching almost curiously, as if the battle had never been about destruction. And in a way, it hadn't. It had been a lesson, not in tactics, not in strategy, but in perspective. The coalition had come to impose order. Humanity had responded by showing that order, without flexibility, becomes fragility. In the quiet that followed, Virex compiled what would become the most studied document in coalition history, not a war report, but a redefinition of conflict itself. He described humanity not as irrational, but as operating on a broader spectrum of logic, one that included emotion, creativity, contradiction, and resilience as integral components rather than weaknesses. He warned that any future interaction with humans would require a fundamental shift in approach, not just in military doctrine, but in philosophy. To face humanity was to face a mirror that reflected not what you were, but what you could not yet understand. And as his report concluded, Virex added a final line, one that would echo far beyond the war, if they ever choose to unite completely, not just in moments, but in permanence, then no force in this galaxy or any other will be able to predict them, contain them, or stop them. The war did not end with a treaty, nor with a final battle that historians could mark as the decisive moment. Instead, it dissolved, like tension released from a system that could no longer sustain it. Coalition forces withdrew in phases, not out of defeat in the traditional sense, but because continuation had become meaningless. There was no stable ground left to stand on, no predictable outcome to pursue. Humanity did not chase them, did not press for dominance, did not even claim victory in any unified voice. That, more than anything, unsettled the coalition. Across intercepted transmissions, there were celebrations, yes, but they were scattered, personal, different. Some humans marked the end of conflict with silence, others with laughter, others with memorials for those lost. There was no single narrative, no centralized declaration, and yet somehow it felt complete. Commander Virex observed this with a growing realization. Humans did not need a defined ending to consider something finished. They decided it was over, and so it was. In the cycles that followed, the coalition began the slow process of analysis and reconstruction. Entire divisions were dedicated to studying human behavior, not just in war, but in all aspects of existence. What they found only deepened the mystery. Humans were inconsistent, often contradictory even among themselves, yet capable of moments of extraordinary alignment. They argued internally, disagreed, diverged in beliefs and methods, yet when faced with external pressure, they could synchronize with a speed and depth that no algorithm could replicate. It was not perfect unity. It was something more fluid, more dynamic, a state of convergence driven not by authority, but by shared intent. Virex contributed extensively to these studies, his perspective shifting from that of a commander to that of an observer trying to understand a fundamentally different form of intelligence. He noted that humans did not separate emotion from logic, as the coalition had long done. Instead, they integrated it, allowing feeling to inform decision, to add layers of meaning and adaptability that pure calculation lacked. It made them sensual, yes, but also incredibly resilient. There were debates within the coalition about future interaction. Some factions argued for isolation, to avoid the risk entirely. Others proposed cautious engagement, seeking to learn from humanity rather than oppose it. A few more radical voices suggested that the coalition itself should evolve, adopting elements of human thinking to overcome its own limitations. This idea was controversial, even dangerous. To change was to admit that the old ways were insufficient. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The war had revealed a flaw, not in strength or technology, but in perspective. Commander Virex found himself at the center of these discussions, not because he had all the answers, but because he had witnessed the question in its purest form. He spoke not of tactics or strategies, but of experience, of watching humans turn chaos into coordination, loss into learning, individuality into unity. He described the moment he understood that humanity was not breaking the rules of war. They were operating on a different set entirely. Eventually, a decision was made, not a grand declaration, not a sweeping reform, but a quiet shift. The coalition would not attempt to conquer humanity again. Instead, it would observe, engage cautiously, and, where possible, collaborate. It was not trust, not yet, but it was respect. And in the vast scale of interstellar relations, that was a beginning. Small exchanges followed, signals sent and answered, data shared in fragments, encounters that were tense, uncertain, but not hostile. Humans, true to form, approached these interactions with the same mixture of curiosity and unpredictability they had shown in war. Some were cautious, others open, a few even welcoming. There were misunderstandings, moments of tension, but also moments of connection that defied expectation. Virex participated in one such exchange, observing a human crew not in battle, but in routine operation. They joked, argued, improvised solutions to minor problems, and adapted continuously to small changes. It was chaotic. It was inefficient by coalition standards, and yet it worked beautifully. In his final recorded log, long after the war had faded into history, Commander Virex reflected not on defeat or victory, but on transformation. He acknowledged that his understanding of war, of strategy, and even of intelligence itself had been incomplete. Humanity had not just challenged the coalition, they had expanded it, forcing it to confront possibilities it had never considered. He ended his log with a statement that would become as influential as his first. Humanity is not tactically insane. Humanity is tactically free. Free from rigid doctrine, free from predictable patterns, free to adapt, to feel, to connect, and to change in ways that no static system could ever match. And that freedom, he concluded, was the most powerful force he had ever encountered. As his log closed, the stars beyond his viewport remained unchanged, silent and vast. But the way they were understood had shifted, forever altered by a species that refused to follow the rules, and in doing so, redefined them for everyone.